have Lieutenant Junior Grade Drew Stevens with us here today. Fun fact, Drew and I have known each other for 16 years now, I think. Somebody do that math, figure out how. Lieutenant Drew Stevens has a BS in geology from UNC Chapel Hill and an MS in marine geology from Trawling, where his research focused on geomorphology in the tidal reaches of the Mississippi and Mekong River deltas. He was a geosteer in the Marcellus Shale and a hydrogeologist for the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality before commissioning in the NOAA Corps in 2018. He sailed the 2-year sea tour aboard NOAA ship Fairweather, then joined the Alaska Fisheries Science Center as Benthic mapping specialist in the Groundfish assessment program. The best thing about his job is finding the crossover between the often separate fields of hydrography and fisheries.
Thanks, Arlie. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So like Arlie said, I'm Drew Stevens. I'm a NOAA Corps officer with a background in geology and hydrographic survey, and I'm currently working at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, AFSC, as a benthic mapping specialist with Dr. Bob McConaughey. And I like to describe my job as bridging the gap between hydrography and fisheries, where I work on various projects linking those two worlds. But today we're going to focus on just one of those topics, and that's the environmental impacts of bottom trawling. And for the hydrographers in the room, I assume that's a lot of you, I'm going to explain how important mapping is for the work that we're doing at AFSC. And before I start, I want to just say that this talk only reflects my personal views and not the views of NOAA or AFSC. So here's my goals for the talk. At the end, I want you to understand what bottom trawling is, and that is important for the economy. We need to know the environmental impacts that make it controversial, as well as the different local conditions that are causing different levels of environmental impact. Also want to know what mapping products help us improve our management of sustainable fisheries. If there's a little bit of time at the end, I've got a couple bonus slides, and then finally we'll have a question and answer session. All right. So what is bottom trawling? Fundamentally, it's dragging a net along the bottom to catch fish. It's been done for a very long time. And over time, people have made a lot of different net designs. Initially, new nets were designed to make the nets bigger and for deeper waters. But as they advanced, they became used to target different species. And more recently, there's been a focus on designing nets that can have a lower impact on the seafloor environment. The most common type of gear net design that we see in Alaska is the otter trawl, shown in the figure here. It gets named from the otter boards that are these huge pieces of metal between the net and the boat that basically allow the captain to pilot how open or closed the net is. And all this gear along the foot rope is this big heavy gear that help it keep in contact and penetrate into the bottom. Also be aware that there's both midwater and bottom trawling here. I'm really going to be talking only about bottom trawling for this presentation. For the history of bottom trawling, here's the current situation, the history leading up to the current situation in Alaska. The first written mention of bottom trawling is in the English Parliamentary Scrolls. And this is like one of my favorite pieces of trawl history. Basically, there was a group of English fishermen that were complaining to the English Parliament that another group of fishermen had brought in bottom trawls, beam trawl from the Netherlands, and that it had this mesh that was too small, taking up too many juvenile fish, and the beam was destroying seagrass. And while it's unclear if the Parliament took any action here, it shows that these people had a fairly sophisticated understanding of their environment and how the bottom trawls were already affecting the environment in the Middle Ages. So cut to the mid 1800s, the Brixham trawler was invented. It's a beautiful sort of sailing ship. And these were the first fishing ships that were built with enough endurance and a strong enough capstan to do deep offshore fishing. Bottom trawling in Alaska wasn't really feasible for a long time because of the low populations and distance to the market. So it isn't until 1933 that we have any recorded history of bottom trawling in Alaska, and that began with actually the arrival of the Japanese trawling fleet. Most trawling in Alaska was either Japanese or Soviet until, specifically in the offshore areas, until about the 1970s, and that increased conflict between Alaska, American fisheries, and these foreign fisheries is eventually a major contributor to the 1976 Magnuson-Stevens Act that established the 200 nautical mile economic exclusive zone for fisheries in the U.S. And it also established the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service and gave us the responsibility for maintaining sustainable fisheries. So here's some examples of different types of bottom trawls. The beam trawls are the earliest type of trawl net, pretty simple to understand. You use a beam to hold the net apart. Below you can see some different types of gear with the tickler chain on the left it's basically used to get fish up off the bottom so that the trawl net doesn't just go over the fish. The rock hopper on the right, or I guess towards the middle, it's meant to prevent the net from getting damaged from going over rocks. Then on the right hand side, there's an electric pulse trawl. I don't have a video of that, unfortunately, but it's basically sending a electric shock in the bottom to get fish to rise up into the water and be caught. It's supposed to be more effective and more environmentally friendly than a tickler chain because it's supposed to not dig into the bottom as much. There's a lot of debate if that's true or not. I'm honestly not really sure if it's true. Also, I don't have a picture of an otter board here, but as I said in the previous slide, those are really big, heavy pieces of steel that make an important difference in how the trawl is riding along the bottom and allows the trawls to be much bigger and wider. And so this is all to point out that there's a lot of variety in trawl gear, and changing the gear changes things like how much it penetrates into the bottom, which is important for the environmental impacts. All right. So why are we bottom trawling? That's really simple. We are trawling for fish. Bottom trawling is a highly effective method of catching fish. It accounts for about a quarter of the world's seafood production every year. And that leads to food security for a lot of people around the world, as well as money and jobs for the economy. Trawling is a really efficient method for fishing. Fishing for groundfish is, for certain groundfish, it's the only economical way to really fish them. So even though the reason for bottom trawling is really simple, I just want you to keep in mind that this is what's driving all the work, and it's a really important reason. So on to the bad parts of trawling, the controversy around it. This list on the side is all environmental impacts. Some have been known about for centuries, and some of them have only really come up on the radar a lot more recently. So overfishing and bycatch can be significant problems if they're not managed properly. These two are a little less hydro related, so I'm not going to talk about them as much today. Just be aware. The image to the right is showing how trawling is depicted by environmental organizations. It can destroy habitat like you're seeing here, the seagrasses. It does mobilize sediment, which can have a lot of cascading effects throughout the ecosystem by increasing turbidity, basically making these sediment clouds you're seeing in the image and that can cause negative impacts from blocking light, burying things, etc. It also can affect nutrient cycling in the sediment, which is really important for the sea life that's living on the bottom and is making a living off those nutrients. And most recently, there's been a push to understand how trawling is affecting the carbon that's stored in marine sediments. There was a recent paper, it was a modeling paper that was saying that trawling releases as much carbon as the global airline industry. Other scientific papers have said things about bottom trawling, like it's clear cutting the ocean, or it's like plowing the deep sea floor. And obviously, all of that stuff is really bad. In response, there have been a lot of calls to ban bottom trawling completely. Some countries, most recently New Zealand, have banned it entirely. And that particular banning, it bans scientific trawling as well. So it's really kind of unclear to us at AFSC how they're going to monitor the effectiveness of the ban. And that's all that information is really important to us, because from what we're seeing, the scientific evidence for the negative impacts of bottom trawling is fairly mixed. I'm going to focus on carbon impacts of trawling today, because that's where my research has been focused, and it's been a really hot topic recently. There was a nice review of 49 studies published, I think last year, that looked at how bottom trawling was affecting the carbon content of marine sediments. This paper didn't exist before the modeling paper that was talking about carbon impacts exceeding that of the airline industry. So that information wasn't really widely known at that point, and I think it would change the results of that study. But you can see that the majority of studies here showed that there was no effect. And we can add I recently completed a study, and we're working on publishing it now. Can add it to that list of no effect. Yeah, but we'll not get into that here. There's also, interestingly, some studies even showed an increase in carbon. About 30% of the studies did show a decrease in carbon content. And I want to be clear that these decreases are real, and they are something we like to avoid. But this is clearly not a linear effect between trawling and decreasing carbon content. We're seeing a similar variability on the biology side of things. Bottom trawls are often affecting the various bottom dwellers, but it's not necessarily in clear-cut, easily understandable ways. We can look at a lot of different species and communities and see, usually either negative effect or no effect, but increases are possible. That's usually things for like scavengers that will come in after bottom trawling, or a species that can recover more quickly and establish dominance in the after effects of trawling. I'm not going to get into those details here because I'm not the best person to do that. But there's a lot of variability on the biology side as well. And that's really confusing. That's a lot of mixed messages that don't make for good fisheries management decisions. So it's our job to figure out what's actually going on here. What is explaining the variability? And so what we're finding is that it's really local conditions. The ocean is a big, diverse place. This is where we can start to get into the meat of this presentation. We're going to talk specifically about some of the mappable conditions that matter and the hydrographic products that can help us. And this might not be a complete list. It doesn't include a lot of the more complex biology. This is really what I've seen is more important during my time at AFSC. So habitat and biota. We've got corals here at the top of the list because they are a poster child of sensitive biota. They are easily damaged by trawls. They take a really long time to recover, but also we can map them with hydrographic tools. Corals create habitat that can and should be protected. And we got this lovely image of Alaska deep sea sponge coral habitat. It's great. We don't want that to be damaged by trawling. Sponges, seagrasses, and shellfish are all sensitive to trawling. The exact level of sensitivity kind of depends on the species, how they're attaching themselves to the bottom, and how deep the trawl gear is digging into sediment. What's really important for understanding the resilience of these species is their recovery rates compared to the intensity of trawling. And that's really variable for different species. There's a lot of information out there. The important thing is knowing that we would like to map these sorts of potentially sensitive habitat and biota. So what I don't have specifically mentioned here is a category I like to call flat and boring. There's a large percentage of the Bering Sea shelf that looks kind of like this barren landscape. But when you drop a grab sampler down, you can actually pull up a lot of interesting little critters buried into the sediment, basically. And for them, it really depends on how deep they burrow, how deep the net digs, and how big they are compared to the mesh of the net. And so the point there is that it's not all sensitive habitat. There are certain types of seafloor habitat that actually may have some resiliency towards bottom trawling. We've had studies in the Bering Sea showing certain types of biota really haven't been impacted by trawl studies that we've done. And so knowing that information just helps us make better management decisions. So bottom trawling, bottom material rather, is a favorite of mine. I feel like a lot of people take bottom material for granted. I like to say I spent 4 years getting a bachelor's degree on rocks, and 2 years getting a master's degree on sand. I don't have a PhD in mud yet, but I'm not that committed to the joke. Maybe someday. Bottom material, and specifically the hardness of the bottom, really makes a major difference in trawl gear penetration depths. The fine-grained materials or mud, when they get suspended, they stay in suspension for a long amount of time. That also allows them to get transported farther away. And it's somewhat common for muds to be rich in nutrients and organic carbon relative to sand. And that leads to the graph you're seeing on the right. This shows that proportionally, studies in sand are more likely to have no effect on carbon content than those in muds. And that's matching our studies in sands in the Bering Sea, where we're finding no effect. Rock, usually considered untrawlable because the nets can get snagged on the gear. Even using rock hopper trawls, fishing boat captains usually want to avoid it. So also useful to know where rock is. So I'm sure you've already seen the GIF of the rock hopper trawl in action. But you can really see how much the bottom is getting pushed around by the trawl in this. I really like this video because it hammers in the point that the trawl is affecting the bottom and the bottom is affecting the trawl. So even though we're focusing on how the trawls affects the bottom today, that relationship goes both ways. And it's really important to have hydrographic data for both. And that hydrographic data really helps us as scientists, as well as the fishing boat captains, know what to expect before the trawl goes down on the bottom. So features we can identify in bathymetry. There's been a lot of debate about the importance of submarine canyons because early on, there are arguments that it was unique habitat. So we did studies in Alaska, determined that that wasn't really true. The organisms living there are roughly the same as those in similar depths and latitudes outside of the canyons. But what turned out to be an issue is that trawling, it leads to erosion along the canyon walls and then preferential deposition in the center that can cause organisms and sensitive habitats down there to be buried much faster than they would naturally. It can also cause turbidity currents, which are currents that gain speed as the material is moving down the canyon wall, kind of like an avalanche. And that can actually cause additional erosion beyond what the trawl caused, as well as preferentially depositing it rapidly in the bottom. And basically that means that trawling can affect areas beyond the footprint of the trawl, especially where there's a steep slope. Sand waves, these guys can be flattened out by trawling. It's not super clear if they're sensitive habitat. They can also affect the ride of the trawl, which affects the trawl's effectiveness. The trawl basically can get launched up the side of a sand wave, lose contact with the bottom, and not be able to catch fish during that time. Methane seeps, these can be identified sometimes with pockmarks on the seafloor, and they are very frequently host of unique habitat, like the shellfish clustering around the methane seep in the picture here. All right, so this is a little bit of a gear switch to talk about the data we get from hydro, how we use it, and basically to tell you all to keep it coming. Bathymetry is used in a lot of ways. We just discussed this seafloor features. It's also really great for putting bounds on where we need to focus our efforts. Most trawling is occurring at depths less than 300 meters, and there's really not any trawling going on at depths greater than 100 or 1,000 meters. It works as a good proxy for understanding what benthic species are in an area, depending on depth. It also helps us understand what levels of natural disturbance we can see in an area. In the Bering Sea, we've recorded that storms can disturb sediments at depths greater than 94 meters, or up to 94 meters rather. Places like the Bristol Bay are much shallower than that. So they're experiencing really high levels of natural disturbance. And we find that that's a major factor when you're comparing it to the disturbance of trawling. And since bottom energies are also related to sediment sizes through winnowing, it can also sort of serve as a proxy for understanding the bottom material. Backscatter is a really big deal. It's complicated to interpret. I haven't done a lot of it, but I know that it's very complicated. I know it's not a totally solved problem, but it's been used to map a plethora of different environmental conditions. And I just want to say here that I've heard many hydro officers and hydrotechs on the NOAA ships say that backscatter can be useless or it's pointless to produce, and that is not true. We want it, we use it, we feel that it is a core part of the slogan, map once, use many times. And so yeah, I'm not discounting that it's difficult to interpret. but it does provide additional information without additional survey time that is really hard to get otherwise. Management options. We don't really need to discuss all these. I just want you guys to know that there are a lot of different ways to manage bottom trawling to ensure that we have sustainable fisheries into the future without enacting total bans. And in particular, we can know that there are a variety of different spatial controls. As you can see here, specifically prohibitions by habitat type and near store restrictions and zoning. And so helping us make better spatial controls is a huge way that hydrographic survey can help us improve the management of bottom trawling. We can't manage what we don't know. We need to establish spatial controls. We can do it with experimentation and direct measurements, but those are really expensive methods and they really only look at small areas. So hydrographic data allows us to cover larger areas much more quickly. And we can use that hydrographic data and try to create more appropriate, better ecosystem models that will let us be much more effective at targeting protection towards the sensitive areas. And hopefully we'll also be able to identify areas that are actually somewhat resistant to increased trawling intensity. We're also going to be seeing an increasingly big and increasingly important moves in fisheries populations shifting with climate change. So we really need to have comprehensive ecosystem research, especially if we're going to consider opening up different areas to fishing. It's really not feasible to do that and to do that responsibly without the good hydrographic data to feed into our models that help us understand the effects of trawling on the whole ecosystem. And so the point that I want to leave you with at that is that we need high quality mapping for good fisheries management. And so that's the end of the core of my talk. I wasn't really sure how long that was going to take because I probably should have practiced a bit more and prepared a little bit earlier, but I've got some bonus slides here. It looks like we got a little bit of time. So I'll just talk about some of the other applications of hydro we have to fisheries. We've done first trawlability studies. That's been a ongoing effort. We've kind of talked about it a little bit throughout this presentation about how there's more rocks in like places like the Gulf of Alaska that can really mess up nets, and it prevents any trawling from happening in those areas with or without any sort of bans on trawling in those areas, and sort of creates these areas where fish are able to get away from that trawl pressure. So it's really important for us to understand where exactly it's possible for trawling to occur. We've also done the survey trawl catchability studies. Those are where we get the information about how the trawls are riding on the seafloor, where they're coming disconnected from the seafloor and losing fishing effectiveness. So that helps us understand exactly how effective the trawlers are when they're out in the ocean. Fish pack is a species distribution study, kind of somewhat related to trawlability, but it's basically Alaska Fisheries Science Center spends a lot of time and money doing fishery surveys to understand fish populations, but we can only trawl in trawlable areas. And so fish pack is designed to help us improve our ecosystem models by increasing our understanding of how many fish and the density of fish in different areas where we can't go and survey with our annual bottom trawl surveys. And then trawl impacts is the one I've been studying the most recently with looking at carbon impacts. Dr. Bob has been doing a lot of work with the Benthic. He's already published the work on the Benthic ecosystem. And so that's really where a lot of the information in this presentation is coming from. Got a little bit of time to talk about the study that I've done on the trawl effects in Bering Sea sediment geochemistry. Bristol Bay is the study setting. We set up a before-after control impact study where we looked at these 4 different aspects of the sediment geochemistry: the total organic carbon, total nitrogen, carbon isotopes, and nitrogen isotopes. And really what we found is there's nothing going on whenever we go trawl through this area. This area is, I should say, it's in a previously completely untrawled area. It has never been trawled by the Japanese fishing fleets or the Soviet fishing fleets from airplane flyover data that we've got going back really far into the past. And then it's been banned, trawling has been banned in this area as far back as we're aware of. So it's a first impact study, and we're just not seeing this major effect on carbon and nitrogen that has been seen in other studies. And that's really what's gotten us onto this local conditions discussion. And so trawl intensity and closures, this is just for your awareness of the current management situation in Alaska. We have a lot of closures to trawling on the right-hand side. I'm sure you can't read the text there. I can barely read the text there. But basically the areas that are shaded in are under various trawl protections. And so you can see that in the trawl intensity figure on the right, which is areas swept in the Bering Sea. And that's where we're seeing in blue, it's basically there's been a trawl put down at some point within a square kilometer, and basically increasing intensity up to the point where every square meter of that square kilometer has been trawled multiple times likely. And so that's really useful information for us understanding where trawling is occurring and understanding what local conditions we need to be looking at so that we can have the best outcomes for sustainable fisheries. All right, that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Questions?
Thank you for the talk, Drew. That was super interesting. In our area, we have, there's concerns about disturbing the bottom sediment around here just because it might kick up toxins that have been left behind from like the Industrial Revolution when mills were dumping their byproduct into the water, stuff like that. Is there any sort of influence on pollution on your coast in terms of does trawling kick up any toxins or anything?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not really sure if it does. I'm not aware of anywhere where we've looked into that. It seems less likely to be an issue for Alaska, but that doesn't mean it's not an issue. I mean, the things like the Exxon Valdez come to mind. Like, that's really interesting. I don't really have an answer for that.
Thank you.
Hey, Drew, thank you for the talk. Very interesting. This is a kind of a non-technical question. It's more a social thing. I wonder if you I'm curious, the fishermen often have a lower opinion of scientists and academe and stuff because there's a real competition in there, but your work is really designed to help the fishermen. Do you have any sense of how you're perceived when you're out there among the fishermen? Whether are you friend or foe, or do they resist you or welcome you?
AFSC tends to have we tend to have a better relationship with the fisheries than what I've heard about on the East Coast. I would say that a lot of the fishermen in Alaska get that sustainable fisheries are very important to their continued existence. So we try to take into account all of these different stakeholders, like specifically Alaska natives are very unique to Alaska situation. Environmental organizations and fisheries, those are kind of the big players. And we try to take all their concerns. So I don't see us as being necessarily trying to help the fishermen per se, but we're trying to have sustainable fisheries.
Okay.
Gabe?
Hi, Drew. This is Gabe Venegas. Love the talk. Thank you for just the distinction, particularly between fine grain and coarse grain sediments and how trawlable they are and how much they impact carbon. I noticed your study was in sands, so it didn't surprise me too much to see that there weren't any changes between trawling, before and after trawling. But do you consider doing a similar experiment in mud?
We are currently looking more towards studying different areas of the Bering Sea, specifically areas that haven't been trawled in the past. And because we are getting political pressure from fishermen to have different areas opened up. So that's not, our focus isn't necessarily on different sediment types at this point. These are also very expensive studies. I would like to see that. I'm not sure exactly how much of the Bering Sea and our fishing area is a muddy bottom, because much of the Bering Sea shelf is this shallow, churned up shelf that has a lot of sand. So it's kind of a really common sediment type that we're seeing in that specific area. So I would say that sand is most relevant for our purposes, but if it becomes more relevant to do mud, then it's certainly, I think there's good potential that we would get a different result.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not really sure what you would catch in mud, and so it might be a non-issue if there's not really any fish that are specifically a bottom-dwelling fish that lives in mud. I'm not sure, but if you do want to pursue that PhD in mud, I'd be happy to have you.
Thank you.
It's Juliet. Were you involved in actually taking the sediment samples? Because taking samples in sand, you're very likely to lose any of the fine grain stuff if you have any really fine stuff, because you can have super nepheloid fluffy stuff and it washes away by the time you get it to the surface.
I was not involved in the field work for this study. It took place pre-COVID. And so I really credit my ability to get more into the research in this program to COVID, because we weren't doing operations, which is normally what I'd be more involved in. There, in our spreadsheet of data, we did specifically look for winnowing and noted if there was evidence of winnowing. Generally, we didn't see it. I don't know specifically how that was done. So I would need to talk to Dr. Bob McConaughey to talk more about if winnowing was occurring in those and what they were doing to look for it. But I know they were.
Hi, Drew. Thank you very much. Dave Fredrickson here. So I have more of a fisheries question. Is that okay if I ask a fisheries question?
You can. We'll see how I do.
So what are the predominant target species for this type of bottom trawling here in Alaska?
So we catch a lot of pollock, a lot of rockfish, various types of soles and flounder, halibut sometimes. Yeah, those are kind of the main ones that I'm aware of.
Are there any other, especially with the flatfish and the bottom dwelling fish, are there other fishing techniques that are a lot less interactive with the bottom, say like long lining with hooks that are prevalent in the fisheries?
Yeah, halibut are mostly caught with long line.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the other ones. I don't think it's quite as effective for them, but usually halibut is your answer.
Thanks.
I have a question about, I think it was just the previous slide, this one, you had kind of a heat map of the areas that have been trawled in the past. Is that data was that data like voluntarily given to you by the fishermen, or is that something that you take from AIS? I'm just curious how that data came about.
I believe it's AIS data. I'm not exactly sure. I got this. Yeah, I don't have a solid background on where that information came from. But
Sense because it has
I know that we do AIS monitoring and kind of look at the vessel speeds to see if they're at a more typical trawling speed versus a transit speed and try to track them some that way. I think that's where this comes from, but I'm not exactly sure.
If anybody out there has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask them. Going once, going twice. Anyone else in the room? Okay, I think that's everything. Thank you very much, Drew.
Thank you.